Welcome to One with the Other Way, a podcast about your journey and finances. I'm your host, James. Today we have Wanda with us, and we're talking about index funds. We had recently had an episode on mutual funds, so this is kind of a part two to that. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
So we talk a lot about data and getting our facts correct, right? And in a world where there's so much information, we want to always make sure that we provide clarity and accuracy to the best of our knowledge. And previously we had said there's about 8,000 mutual funds. Well, I have clearly hadn't been keeping up with the market because there's now over 10,000 mutual funds. And in that world, right, we talked about index funds, and index funds are just a small part of the 10,000 mutual funds that are available. In fact, they represent about 20% or about 2,000 currently index funds. So I think today we want to talk about what is an index fund, right? What are the advantages of index fund? And then maybe what are the disadvantages? We'll cover those three things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is an index fund? And I guess I should also say by disclosure, I do use index funds as a financial planning tool in our office with our clients. Index funds are really just a basket of the stocks that make up a particular financial index. I think, like, for example, right, you talk about the S&P 500. There are 500 stocks that make up the S&P 500. And those stocks are picked by the S&P board. They every year say these companies will make up our 500 stocks that will be in the index. Same with the Dow Jones, which is another index. The Dow Jones generally has 31 companies that make up that index. And the Dow Jones board selects the funds.
So, Wanda, talking about these boards, for instance, the S&P 500,
Right.
what kind of criteria do they use to determine what companies enter or leave the index?
That's a good question. So there are 500 companies, and then the Standard & Poor's says these 500 companies are the largest publicly traded companies in the U.S. market that the Standard & Poor's board feels represent the economy broadly. So every year they're selecting companies that they're going to move in and out of the index. So some examples of companies that have been taken off of the index include companies like Kodak. You remember the picture company, right? They're all gone, right? U.S. Steel. If you think about this American steel industry, that got pulled. The New York Times, actually, one of the companies that got pulled. And again, it's for a variety of reasons. They think these companies no longer reflect the business environment in the United States. Companies that have been added to the list, you would not be surprised, would include companies like Facebook. And I'm amused, right? Under Armour, of course, is on the index, right?
Okay.
That got added. Remember, like 20 years ago, we didn't even know what that was. And now it's on the S&P 500 as one of the 500 largest publicly traded companies. 20 years ago, I don't think that was, we knew what that was. Under Armour now, we all work out with it. PayPal, right? Again, that's a company that was added to the index. Urban Outfitters was taken off the index. So every year, like I said, they decide what companies they want to have in the index. And the S&P 500 is one. So you've got the S&P 500, right? And then I've already mentioned the Dow Jones. The old school, right? We used to always talk about the Dow Jones as reflective of what was going on in the market, 31 companies. And then we have the S&P 500. People feel that's more broad to what's going on in the market. And now then we have the Russell indexes. Again, it's just the Russell Corporation saying these are companies that we think reflect what's going on in the market. Morgan Stanley has their own indexes, MSCI indexes. And so there are a lot of mutual funds and they purport to represent the underlying index. And those indexes are really just companies that were put on by boards that said this represents the S&P 500. This represents what we think are the largest publicly traded companies in the U.S.
Well, that leads me to ask the next question here, which is, so you have all these different indexes of different sizes. How do you start to determine which one you should go for if you were going to buy an index fund?
Right. If you're going to buy an index fund. First, I wouldn't buy an index fund for myself. As I said, by disclosure, periodically, I will use an index fund. And potentially, we're going to talk about the advantages of it. But with a world of 2,000 of these index funds, right, how do you go about picking one? So you can do a lot of searches on index funds that will focus on companies that do the thing that you want to do. Most people think that if they select something like the S&P 500, that's a broad index of all companies in the US, 500 companies. Recently, there's been a lot of press to what we call the Mag 7, the Magnificent Seven companies that make up the S&P 500. So the Mag 7 is the Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, NVIDIA. I think I got them all, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So now consider for a moment there's 500 companies out there, and those 7 companies represent about 30% of the index, about a third of that index. That means that 492 companies represent the remaining largest global companies that we spoke about earlier, right? And so if we're talking about diversification, right, are we really diversified when in fact we're in the S&P 500? And a third of our index is in these 7 companies.
Do you think that the S&P 500 would be an accurate depiction of the market?
Well, it could be accurate, right? Because these are, by definition, the largest globally traded companies. So that by definition, it does reflect. But is it how you should be investing is probably a better question, right? Should I be investing in these things, right? And so I'm looking at these 7 companies, and they represent a third of the index. Should I be investing in these companies, right? And it's funny because, the longer as you do it in this industry, right, you find that there's a lot of things that move in and out of popularity. See, about 10 years ago, we had the FANG, right? I don't know. Were you
I've
familiar with the
never heard of
FANG?
the FANG.
Oh my goodness, see what happens, right? So as things change, they stay exactly the same. The FANG at that time was about 10 years ago, was Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google.
Oh,
Yeah. And then it became the FANG, which added Apple to the mix.
Apple. Yeah,
Yeah, right,
yeah.
exactly.
And
And
now it's the Mag 7, but
now it's Mag
Netflix was
7.
out.
Netflix is out. And so are we representing the market if Netflix is no longer in that index, right? Or in that top 7, rather, I should say.
Well, what's
Um,
the
mm,
difference then between having an S&P 500 index versus just being invested in the Mag 7?
right, exactly. So a lot of people who will chase performance, right? Statistically, if I'm looking at a performance and I see something, normally by the time I see it as an investor, the hype is over.
Hmm.
Someone's going to mention it on TV and all the action is gone because news inevitably is reporting of things that have already happened. So
That
you
makes
as an
sense.
investor are going to look at that and you're going to say, oh, I should be investing in the Mag 7, but the Mag 7 is over probably. I was
Yeah.
already into the next thing. But in spite of my crystal ball here in my office, I still cannot predict, right, the next thing, right? We can predict this, though, that the market will go up and down and that different companies will represent the S&P 500. And so what's hot today, right, may not necessarily be, hot tomorrow, right? That's like technology, right? Every time something new comes in, right, the half-life gets smaller and smaller. So going back to this index, right? We got the 500 companies that are representing the index, right? Now, here's the thing, right? I use things that appeal to me to describe. If I go to the grocery store, I really am an ice cream aficionado. Like, I love ice cream. I can tell you all about fat content and sugar content and what's put in and which ones you should get and which ones are just sugar. So, and when I go down the aisle of the grocery store, there are probably 100 ice creams there. Now, if I want to ensure that in my freezer I have a broad diversification of ice cream, right? One would think that I would go down and get each one of them and
Hmm.
put them in my freezer because then I have everything, every possible ice cream that I can have. I have it in my refrigerator, and I have ones that taste good and one that doesn't taste good. But we
Yeah.
never go to the grocery store and do that. We go and we pick our favorite ice cream, the one that has the things the way we like it, right? The ingredients
Hmm.
represented the way I like it. So consider that on the index fund. If I don't do that on my food choices when I go to the store, things that are important to me on a day to day basis, how's that possible that going into the market and saying, I want one of everything? You see, and I think that would go in the disadvantage column, maybe. This is maybe not the type of diversification that helps in the long run.
Hmm.
One of everything isn't better, right? One of everything is just one of everything.
Well, I guess then, so if we're looking at the side of the disadvantage, what are the advantages then?
Yeah,
What
right.
makes them appealing?
Right, distinctly, there's the top advantage of having an index fund, of course, is the cost associated. Yet I go right and say that just because something's cheap doesn't mean it's the best thing for you, right?
That's true.
Mm. So cheap isn't necessarily better. Cheap is just cheap sometimes. And so the thing with the index fund is that if the S&P Corporation says these 500 companies represent, the largest global companies in the US market, then you can write a computer program and say, I'm going to take one of each one of those 500 companies. And you can do it two ways, right? You can do it by what they call market cap or
Hmm.
by equal weighted. Market cap says that in this example of the Mag 7, if they represent 30% of the portfolio, then they represent 30% of my index.
Oh, okay.
Mhm. And then equally weighted says that I'm just going to take one stock of each one of them and it's going to be
Oh, okay.
equal. So the one company is going to represent 1/500th of my index.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right, right. Which brings up another point when you're selecting an index fund, is Vanguard's going to have an S&P 500 stock index fund. Fidelity is going to have one. All the big mutual fund companies are going to
And
have.
what's the difference?
It goes back to how they write their software to buy the stocks that go in and out of their indexes,
Oh, interesting.
and the frequency they trade and the frequency that they update based on market conditions and that kind of thing. They're going to be very closely aligned, right? But it has to do, like I said, with how their software people write their database and, to take the buy sell actions on the backside. So going back to my ice cream, right? I don't take one of everything, right? So you want to think that's a disadvantage to have one of everything. But the advantage is, right, that it doesn't cost a lot. Because if all I do is write a software program and it says, I'm going to do market cap of each of those 500 companies, or I'm going to do equally weighted. At the end of every day, I'm going to buy and trade based on what's going on in those indexes. That's very cheap, right? There's no people necessarily involved with that. That's all computer driven. And so very low cost. And then it becomes dependent on where the index fund resides in terms of how much it costs. So an
Hmm.
index fund that is at Vanguard has a reputation for being the most economical ones, right? You would be surprised, though, that other investment companies, such as the American funds, can actually match the costs associated with Vanguard index funds. Kind of
Interesting. I
interesting,
did
yeah,
not know about that.
yeah, yeah.
I guess then kind of a question that comes to my mind is, at least growing up, I would hear that index funds were the most stable option. Is that an accurate description
Yeah,
of index
stable.
funds?
Yeah, stable is relative, right? Because Netflix had a big run up and went. Remember, I was mentioning the FANG. It represented a lot of the index when it didn't really have the legs. It didn't really have the numbers to support its stock price, right? So stock price is a function of, how much a company is earning, right? And then the demand for it, right? If everybody wants to buy it, it's going to drive prices up. And so there was a lot of buzz on Netflix. It was on the news a lot, and then it drove stock prices up. And so it represented more of the index. So any index fund would be required to be buying it.
And now you have companies like
Mm-hmm.
Nvidia that
Mm-hmm.
have the spike in growth as well.
Yeah, right.
You know,
But NVIDIA, right, just a few weeks ago had a big sell off because the company came out and had a report that said that they were going to adjust some of their earnings reports or
mm,
earnings predictions or whatever. And so that caused a sell off in the video, which of course rippled across the market. So you don't necessarily get more stability in those funds because the action, the buy and the sell on the index is based on whatever's going on in the market on a day to day, right? So Salesforce had a report of some issues with their numbers and there was a big sell off there and that rippled
mm.
across the market. So the Salesforce price comes down and it's represented in the S&P 500 index. That brings a whole S&P 500 index fund down, even though the other 499 companies, they didn't have necessarily that kind of news.
That makes
And
sense.
when the whole index comes down and people look and they say, my index fund is down, I want to sell it, that again brings price down because there's a sell off going on.
So there's a lot of variability due to the individual companies in them having an effect on the whole.
Yeah, yeah. So when you ask about volatility, right, there's a lot of ripple factor that affects the entire index.
That makes sense.
which have nothing to do with the index. So again, a key advantage of index mutual fund is that it's minimal cost because a computer program is driven to make the buy sells. A disadvantage is that it must invest in all of the companies, regardless of whether or not those companies represent a value. And then, from my personal opinion, again, I use the ice cream example. I don't buy all the ice cream, I buy the one that I want. If you think about that or juxtapose that against a advised mutual fund, the fund manager is going to go in and say, that's the ice cream I want. Oh, I mean, that's the stock that I want, this one. I want NVIDIA because I think the numbers represent good value for where I'm putting investor money.
Mm,
Mutual fund managers take a lot of time determining which companies they want to put in their portfolio.
hmm
And so, arguably, right, when you talk about volatility, it's probably less volatile because they're going to spend a lot of time researching a company, going to board meetings at the company, looking at the books. I use an example of the hotel industry, right? Oh, I think, I don't pick on somebody. I don't think Hilton's a good brand name or Marriott's a good brand name, or look at all these IHG commercials. What's not to love about chocolate chip cookies? That's a DoubleTree, right? so
Yeah.
so right, but like you're like, I as a consumer think that's fantastic, but a mutual fund manager is going to look and say, hey, what's the average price of the room? What's the average occupancy rate? How much leverage is that company out on each one of their properties? What's the prediction looking forward in that hotel industry? What's the amount of deferred maintenance that needs to be done? Are the
hmm
properties older? Where you and I are just saying chocolate chip cookies, I like that.
Yeah, they
So,
get more. They get a deep dive in the background that we don't
right.
have an eye to.
Right. And so when they select a company, they understand and know that that company's in there for the long haul. Business cycles will last 5 to 8 years. And so you would imagine in an advised mutual fund, right, with a fund manager, that stock's going to be in there for about 5 to 8 years as it goes through a business cycle. Because in fact, I'm looking at something and I want to make money over time, then I'm going to want to be a part of the entire business cycle of whatever company that is that's working, right?
And so,
Mm-hmm.
kind of relating this back to index funds, indexes they change year by year,
Day by day. Well,
day by
the
day.
boards make the selections. You're right, year over year. Companies represent their percentage in the index daily, right? Or however software is written.
But you don't get a choice in what you get in the index. You just
Mm-hmm.
pick the whole index, as opposed to an advised managed fund.
Mm-hmm. I like to think of an index fund in simple terms. Let's say that 10 companies represent the index. And each of those 10 companies cost $10 a share. Not that we could do something like that, but if we could simplify it down that way. Each of the shares represent 10, and I'm going to invest $100. That means I would get 10 shares, $10 each of
Of
them,
each
right?
one.
Mm-hmm. I have a representation of each one of those 10 companies. My $100 is going into that index of these 10 companies. If one of those companies did really well and that $10 shifted to $20, right? And then all the other ones shifted downward proportionally, right? I think to $9 or $8,
hmm
right? And some change. And I invested another $100, right? My $100, right? Does that $20 stock represent more of my $100 or less? It's $100, but that $20, that $10 stock went to 20, so it represents more of my $100.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
makes sense, right? So it represents more of my $100. But the question is, did I want to buy more of that $20 stock, or is this the time to sell it?
that's true.
So, but an index fund has no choice there. It can't
You have
apply
all of
human,
them.
right. It can't apply human reasoning. It can't say, why is that $20? And is this the time to get out and sell?
That makes sense.
And see, that's completely emotional, but I think that's a disadvantage, right? You're going to do exactly what the index says, and you have no insight into it. Fund manager has no insight into it. Nobody can dictate and say, that's probably something we need to sell at this time. So
Yeah,
basically, an
good.
index fund is a mutual fund that holds companies that represent a particular index, depending on where that's coming from, S&P 500, Russell, we talked about that. The advantages is completely on the cost side of the house, I think. The disadvantages, I think, are the ones that we should give some thought around, right? Is this how you want to invest? And then it's limiting you, right? No decisions, right? Is that really how I want to invest? Want to just pick 500 companies and we're all good? Do I really want to be investing in, well, I don't know, Tesla's number's not so good. Do I really want to be investing in Tesla at the moment? Or do I really want to
Well,
invest in some of this?
Well, thank you for listening to today's podcast on index funds. Wanda, thank you for being on here to provide some clarity. If you would like to schedule an appointment with Wanda, you can find us at financesforreallife.com. We have a button on the website. You can click schedule an appointment.
Yep.
Find some time on Wanda's calendar. She'd be happy to meet with you. We produce our podcast every 2 weeks, so you'll see this one, and then 2 weeks later you'll see the next one. We're on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube currently. So as we expand, we'll update where we offer, and you can find that on our website as well. So thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Investing in mutual funds and index funds involves risk, including possible loss of principal. Fund value will fluctuate with market conditions and may not achieve its investment objective. There is no guarantee that a diversified portfolio will enhance overall returns or outperform a non-diversified portfolio. Diversification does not protect against market risk. Dividend payments are not guaranteed and may be reduced or eliminated at any time by the company.